Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Barricades podcast. Today with me is Ben Burgis. He's a university professor. He currently teaches at Georgia State University. He's also a contributor for the Jacobin magazine. And he also has a podcast that you can follow on his YouTube channel. Ben Burgis discussed a lot of very controversial topics like the cancel culture, and he is also the author of a very interesting book, Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, where he discusses a lot of the things like how you should oppose Ben Shapiro without threatening to cancel him. So thank you very much for accepting to be here with us, Ben, and I hope your viewers will be thrilled with your presence at our podcast.
Oh, thank you, Maria.
So what I wanted to talk to you about today is a problem that for me is very troubling.
Mm.
As I told you in my email, here in Romania, after 3 decades of very violent neoliberal politics, we finally had a progressive party, the Party of Democracy and Solidarity. And I was among the first members of this party, and I was very enthusiastic about finally having a left voice. Now, the problem is that in terms of cultural values, this party
Mm.
was very progressive, but it had no way and it had no power to appeal to the masses. And as I told you already, Romania is an extremely poor country, like third world poverty.
Mm.
So decades of neoliberalism meant that 32% of the Romanians live in poverty. So that's 1/3 of our country. And we also have people who are working but are still very poor because the minimum wage is around $500. The prices are like the ones in the US, just imagine. And the problem is that 60% of the Romanian workers work for the minimum wage.
Right.
So you see, there is this, I think, important need to have a left-wing political party, but we weren't able to get to these people because Romania also ranks first among the European Union countries in terms of religious beliefs.
Mm.
Romania is a conservative country, deeply conservative country, where a lot of people are self-identify as Orthodox and church-going people. So how are we going to reconcile the ideals of a progressive political movement that has very progressive views on LGBTQ and women's rights with such a conservative workforce? I don't have an answer. I don't expect you to come up with one, but I would be very interesting to see what you think about it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for inviting me to come on. I think I guess I should preface this by saying that obviously, we're talking about a country that I've never been to, and I can't say anything with any confidence about any of those specifics that you just mentioned. But I think that, I mean, to one extent or another, I think there's a problem in a lot of places, even in the U.S., which is a vastly more secular society, and where on a lot of issue positions, probably the starting point, for the majority of the population is much better. At least it is now, right? That they that um, we have things like, broadly speaking, majority support, in the American working class for, for gay marriage equality and some degree of abortion rights and things like that, right? Which might not be the case, right, in Romania from what you're describing. But even now, even then, right, like even despite that very different starting point, I think you still have a disconnect on some cultural issues, and I think from when we were talking off air, it sounds like even though the situation is so different, I think that maybe the Romanian left, the like culturally, might not be very different, right? From what you get in countries like the United States, even though the population is very different. Uh, and and so I think that you have an issue not so much in the US with like the basics of like what I think of as like the kind of non-negotiable political stuff. Like, okay, if somebody says, um, I want to support you, but I want to be able to, discriminate against black people or something like that, right? Then as my late friend Michael Brooks would put it, that'd be a very short conversation. I'd say, okay, no, thank you, but even though, but I think the issue comes up not so much with the sort of those sort of political basics, but with things that are a lot more nebulous than that, things that have a lot to do with what I think might be part of the source of the issue you're describing also, which is that so many leftists, I mean, look, clearly including myself, right, come out of this kind of academic background, that world, right? Uh, and so it's and because of that, I think you often get people really fixated on issues about language, right? Of how you're allowed to describe things and talk about them, of what are almost issues of like a certain kind of very woke manners, right? That like you have to approach things in this really specific way that essentially involves all of these like rules about who can say what when about who, that most people just aren't going to have access to, and most people's initial response to is going to be just to be very annoyed by, right? I think that's the almost inevitable response of most people who aren't already acculturated into that, especially when it's combined with the issue of what we sometimes call cancel culture, right? Which would just be the kind of basically what you get through the combination of people feeling very atomized in real life, which has a lot to do, I think, with the kind of stage of capitalism we're living under, and social media technology that really incentivizes people's worst impulses. And so when you combine that with what we were just talking about, then you often get this phenomenon where people are very quick to like denounce each other for minor transgressions of some norms about what language to use, what exactly how to think and talk about certain issues. And when I say that, to be clear, right, I'm not talking about like having a norm against, calling somebody ethnic or sexual slur or something like that, right? Like we tend to talk about things that are a lot less obvious than that, right? And a lot more, like uh, that a lot more specialized. And so I think all of which is just to say, right, that like even though I'm sure it's a much worse problem in Romania, given the very different cultural starting point, I think that's a problem even in countries like the United States, and I certainly, as you say, don't pretend to have a solution. But I think that any answer is going to have to involve like thinking hard about like, okay, what are the sort of non-negotiable priorities, right? What are the things we actually can't compromise on, and then what are the things that maybe we could live with calming down about a little bit. And so I would say beyond like for example, I mean, I think something that I would say, right, is fairly non-negotiable, is having, is insisting on equal civil and legal rights for everybody, that you can't, that we don't want employers to be able to fire somebody for being gay, for example, right? Like that's something uh, that that's certainly essential to the kind of society we want, and to building and to building solidarity across all of these different lines for that. Uh, but that's not necessarily the same as saying that you have to have that everybody who you are willing to work with, or or anything like that, right, has to have exactly the same attitudes in their heads about all of those subjects. And I think that's really the distinction that I'd make, right? Like what's material reality, and what's somebody having like some damaging and unenlightened cultural attitudes. And I say that not to say that the second thing doesn't matter, right? Like that it's unimportant, it's a nothing, right? It's clearly not a nothing. Those things like do real damage to people's lives. But as far as a political movement, right, oftentimes I think you can convince people to get together with you on a policy level, right? That's like, okay, I'm willing to support this movement that would make my life a lot better, because right now I'm in that 60% of the Romanian population working for this miserable minimum wage. And I either support, or if I don't support, I'm at least willing to live with, right? The sort of insistence on broad civil and legal equality across all of these boundaries. But I'm not going to have anybody kind of standing at the doorway, right, interrogating me about everything that I think about all of these things.
Well, you say that if somebody would say homophobic things and they would say they want to support it, that would be a very short conversation. But it seems to be the case in Romania because
Well, let's.
how do you
Okay, sorry.
approach, how do you go to a factory and tell people about gay marriages and abortions? And there is also a problem here, a much deeper one, because of course, a lot of the infighting that's been going on in the leftist circle, it's been our own doing. Let's admit it, because we are a little bit narcissistic and we are all intellectuals. As I've been telling you in the Demos party, it was a very elitist movement. Everybody had a PhD, or almost everybody had a PhD, a master's degree at least. So we only had one worker, a taxi driver, and he was a bit misogynistic and he was thrown out. So the only worker in a socialist party was thrown out.
Right.
And this is the situation where we are now. We have, and I have to admit, he was misogynistic. I have to admit that. So he was thrown out.
So
But at the
it's
same time,
yeah.
you don't get to pick your fights, because the right wingers are going to smear you, and they are going to say to the people in the factory, look, this is Maria Cernat, she's been a supporter of the abortions, and she's a crazy feminist, don't listen to her, she's going to take the LGBT community and have them come to your houses and kidnap your children. And let me just give you a brief tale of a recent episode here in Romania. We had local elections on September 27, and prior to that, a few weeks prior to that, we had some people that were posing as Union Save Romania, that's a newly formed political party. So they were posing as activists for this political party, but also as activists for gay people. And they went to a village in Romania trying to scare people, but by making the villagers believe that all the politicians in the Union Save Romania are for gay marriages or things like that. So it worked because people are going to be scared. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, as I said, right, I'm certainly not going to claim to have any magical solution here, but on the first thing you said, right, about saying homophobic things, I would make a distinction between saying I want to support you, but that's conditional on, right, you supporting, the like letting businesses or landlords discriminate against gay people, and I want to support you and I have some homophobic attitudes, right? That, like, I think the first one's a much shorter conversation. Second one, the second one, I actually think if you look at the history of the labor movement, I think there's some evidence that one of the best ways of diminishing some of these prejudices is by having people work together, for a common end, and that helps them see the humanity of people that they're working with, right? Like, even if you go back to like the very early 20th century United States, where obviously racism was even much worse, than it is now. I think you see some of that, for Black and white workers. And in any case, this, even if at the end of the process, people do still have some of these damaging prejudices, then at least the if you've gotten people to support a political platform, like candidates, for example, right, who aren't going to support discriminatory measures, then that's made the lives of gay people in that example better off than they would be if those politicians hadn't been elected. So, and I guess also, like, this is not very deep, but like I guess the other thing I would say about this is that we probably want to separate out the question of what we support, right, from what we're emphasizing, right, in every context. Like, you know, uh, like right-wing parties that have socially conservative views that might be very popular, but also support, like, I don't know, privatizing daycare, something like that, right? They don't run on the second thing, right? They run on the first thing because they know that it's more popular. That's what they emphasize. And I think that oftentimes, again, obviously this wildly varies country to country, whatever, but like oftentimes I think the left can do the opposite, right? Like, you don't have to put all of your emphasis on the least popular part of your platform. You can say, that's not to say you should lie about it, right? But I mean, but I think you can put a lot more time and energy into the things that you think more people are going to come around on, and I mean, that doesn't solve the problem of the misogynistic cab driver member, right, necessarily, especially depending on how his misogyny was expressing itself. And I mean, I could see, who knows, right? I mean, obviously that comes in degrees. I could imagine that could be expressing itself in some way that created a lot of problems, and it really was justified to kick him out. Who knows, right? But like, but but broadening it out, right, to who's going to support it, right? Then you could have, you might have lots of people who have bad attitudes, in their heads, but are willing to enter into a political coalition for the sake of things that make their lives better. And I guess the last thing I'd say about this is, even, in that kind of, like, I think that there's something to be said for picking your battles, and so it and I think this also goes back to the question of how these things come in degrees, right? Like, in other words, are you in a position where you're saying that anybody that somebody, that like somebody is like really causing a lot of problems, right? Because they're really like obnoxiously pushing, like whatever the worst, attitude they have is, and that might be like a real issue that has to be dealt with, even if it's incredibly weird and ironic and embarrassing that the only working class member of a socialist party is being kicked out, or you know there could be a scenario where you see that some of that is going on to some extent. They say, well, like, right now we have to think about what our priority is today, right? Like is our priority concern today these attitudes existing in the party too much? Is our priority concern today the fact that the party is 99.9% people with PhDs, and we need to broaden it out. And I'm certainly not claiming that I can, that I can make any sort of judgment from thousands of miles away based on hearing about it for a minute, right? About what the right answer is to that, right? But I mean, I think that what I would say with confidence, right, is that I think the left internationally oftentimes makes the mistake as a result of like the deep defeats of the last several decades, right? Um, the whole era of, Tina, right? There is no alternative, neoliberalism, that we've gotten so far removed from real world power for so long that I think that oftentimes there's a temptation, uh, or not just temptation. There's a thing that happens, right, where we reduce politics. We end up seeing politics less in terms of a realistic attempt to change anything than as a way of demonstrating the depths of our own ideological commitment. Uh, and and that's and what that leads to is a lot of people on the left not even thinking that questions like we were just talking about, okay, what's your priority in this situation? If this is it, then you might have to compromise on this other thing, right? If it's this other thing, you might have to compromise on this. Like not even really seeing those as questions, right? Because those are questions that you ask if you think you might actually win. And so you have to, you have to figure out, what's stopping you, what you're willing to do to do it. But if all you're doing is just proving to yourself or proving to other people how much you care, then those questions don't even arise in the first place, because of course you just go to 10 on everything all the time.
Yes, another problem, very serious one, is that oftentimes also in Poland and in Romania also we have to choose between two very toxic forms of right-wing politicians. Let me explain. Andrzej Duda was elected the president of Poland, and he's the representative of a very conservative Catholic fundamentalist party, Law and Justice.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is that people voted for this party. Why? Because I don't know if you knew that, but they raised the child allowance to almost 120 euros,
Mm-hmm.
allowing a lot of families in Poland, especially those who had many children, to basically have a better life.
Mm.
So you have this type of political party that gives you more in terms of money and financial benefits. So from the economic point of view, they are more left-wing, but in terms of cultural values, they are extremist. Okay, so they basically are discriminating against LGBT. And if you just saw what their Ministry of Education was saying on live television, you would be appalled. He basically said that the LGBT people are not normal and that they are not like us. And we should definitely abandon all this idiotic thing about equality and human rights. But you have, on the other hand, and this is also true for Romania, a somehow more progressive political force in terms of cultural values and where they stand on questions like abortions of gay rights. But they would definitely privatize even air, even the air that we breathe. So you have this false, I don't know, you don't really have an option here. What do you do in this type of situation?
Yeah, I have no idea. I mean, I guess as you're saying that, all I could think is that, in some ways, right? Like here in the United States, we're very lucky as far as that goes, which makes it very funny that that so many leftists here still refuse to make those sorts of choices, right? Because we have the awful, terrible neoliberal Democratic Party and the aggressively right wing Republicans, but
Yes,
the,
just a minute. I was just going to say that this resembles a lot with what the Democrats do, because in terms of cultural values, they seem a lot more progressive than the Republicans. But in terms of the economy, they are pretty much the same. While the Republicans, at least when Trump came to power and he promised to bring back the jobs and take care of the working people, he seemed like more interested in giving some benefits, financial benefits to the working people. But in terms of cultural values, let's not go there because he's a terrible conservative and very
yeah,
diplomatic mentality.
yeah, right. Although, like I said, I mean, it's an easier choice here because even though there was some of that rhetoric, when Trump first came to power, his actual record on those issues in office has been like a pretty normal Republican, which is to say, even worse than the Democrats. So that there's no particular trade-off there, right? Like in other words, like the left rightly hates Biden. There are lots of good reasons to hate him, but I think that but in terms of of issues like who's gonna, you know, like people not being kicked off of Medicaid or other things like that, that he is still he is still the lesser evil there, which when I say that, right, doesn't mean that I have any particular illusions that I mean, I think there are some people who make a mistake in the opposite direction and think that Biden as president could be pushed to like do all sorts of great reforms or anything like that. I don't think any of that's true, right? Like I think that that it would be I think that it would be the Obama administration part two, right? It would just be the same thing again. But at least in that instance, in terms of both economic issues and cultural issues, the Trump and the Republicans are worse, which makes it again, which makes it ironic that it's that saying, okay, well, make a tactical decision and vote for the enemy you'd prefer to fight with for the next 4 years is such a controversial position on parts of the U.S. left, right? When it could be so much worse, right? Because we could be facing the trade-off that you just described, and I don't know, right? Like I think that if because I suspect that sort of culturally right-wing party that's doing that is that's expanding the child allowance, etc., right? That it's still not going to be doing the things that I think are most important economically, which would be like making it easier for workers to form unions and things like that, right? Which in terms of the long term, uh, I think is the most important thing, right? That would be at stake in an election like that, which isn't to minimize like seeing things cut or privatized. Obviously, that's awful, right? And you want to avoid that if you can. But yeah, I have no, like, I guess just from that level of description, right? I have no idea, right? Which is going to be worse. I think it really depends on what you think that each one is going to be able to get away with doing, in between now and the next election. If the like horrible neoliberal party, like if in your judgment, right, you think they're actually going to be able to get away with like lots of cuts and lots of privatizations in whatever term they're being elected to, whereas maybe the culturally conservative party, they say horrible things, maybe they've done some horrible things, but you don't think that there's a lot of extra damage that they would do in the next 4 years, then maybe that would be the lesser evil. But I have no idea. I certainly don't envy the choice.
Yeah, it is very difficult, and it is also difficult because unfortunately we as leftists are now allowed to pick our battles, because if you have a
Right.
government like the Romanian or a parliament like the Romanian parliament, where the Social Democrats forged an alliance with the National Liberals and voted a law saying that all discussion on gender should be banned in all Romanian educational institutions. That was voted, and the president attacked it and sent it to the Constitutional Court, and we are waiting for the decision, fingers crossed, that they accept that it is unconstitutional, but otherwise, just think about it. So you have so much power and things are so bad that you don't even have the luxury of picking your fights, because you would go to a factory, you would be a militant leftist, but there's no time because they are doing so much damage on this in this area that you cannot ignore it. I would gladly ignore, even though I'm an activist and a feminist, I would gladly ignore that if I had the chance, but I don't have it because they are doing so much damage at this level that you are constantly put against the wall. You know, you only react, you don't act. And I think
Yeah,
this is one of the problems.
yeah. I mean, at least you can choose. You can't choose whether or not you have to react to the issue, but you can at least choose how you react to it. And I guess my instinct, again, not knowing anything about the details of any of this, right? But my instinct would be that there's a way of reacting that would be to like really engage on the issue that they're raising, right? That you're going to the factory and they say, oh, don't listen to her, she's supports a late term abortion, whatever they're saying, right? And then you just start arguing with them about that, right? And then maybe there's this reacted, and I'm not saying that either of these is foolproof or even like is necessarily going to work, right? But there's reacting like that, and then there's reacting by saying they're bringing this up to try to distract you because because they know that if we organize this factory or whatever, then they'd have to pay you more and they make less money, and I think and again, I'm certainly not saying that second thing is a magic bullet, right? I mean, I'm sure people have done that and it hasn't worked, right? But I think, but I can at least imagine some people reacting the first way and that making the whole thing a lot worse.
Yeah, well, I liked a lot what Bernie Sanders did because he was able to keep his head above the water and to stay focused on some particular topics that were related to economy and to inequality. And even though he was smeared, they got women of color saying he's a white male. They got all sorts of people trying to smear him, saying he's a white old man. So he shouldn't be accepted as a leftist. He managed to keep his head above the water and to keep things on the right track. It didn't serve them until the end because Joe Biden, this non-leader, as I call him, was elected.
Right.
He's some sort of Agent Smith from the Matrix, the perfect representative of the system. Okay, a retired Agent Smith from the Matrix. But he was able to do that. Still, it is so sad to see that what Professor Spivak proposed, like strategic essentialism, that is, you have to bend the rules of logic in terms of getting people in a power position just because they are people of color or women, because you have to tilt back the balance because it was tilted for so many centuries. Well, that proves to be a dead end, in my opinion, and that leads to a lot of infighting and a lot of the problems that we are dealing with now. And we are never going to appeal to the masses with the very sophisticated intellectual things that we are talking about, because as engaging, challenging, and interesting as that they might be, there is no way now to make it appealing to the masses. And there is also another problem. I saw it in most of the online debates. Most of the feminists say, I don't have to educate you, because a lot of the guys said, look, I don't know how to react, okay? So I was raised in a very conservative Romania. I never read anything about feminism. I only heard about feminism from right-wingers trying to smear feminists. And unfortunately, a lot of the feminists say, go educate yourself. And I don't think that's the way to do it. And this reminds me of what my husband said to me when I was fighting with some family member, a right winger. And he said, look, it took you years to end up here where you are. Just be a little more tolerant and more patient with
Yeah.
and do a lot of the educating because we are fighting but not educating. What do you think about
Yeah, I mean, I always say that, yeah, that drives me crazy. That it's not my job to educate you. I mean, if you see yourself as a political activist or organizer, or want to contribute to achieving any kind of political goal, then literally your entire job is to educate people, right? That's what you're doing, right? Like if you want to actually convince people so they side with you about something, then yeah, you do have to. If I mean, if this brings us back to whether the point of politics is to try to change the world or to try to demonstrate the depths of your commitment, and if all you're doing is kind of taking a stand in the sense of expressing your commitment, then sure, why educate anybody else, right? Like they have, like, you're showing off how committed you are and you're condemning them for not sharing it, and you've achieved all of your goals. But if you want the world to be different, and you think it's important that people's attitudes be different in some way to change it, then you have to educate them, and you also have to be realistic about what that looks like, because, as you say, most people don't have like instantaneous road to Damascus conversions. They do sometimes, but that's not usually how political persuasion works. And sometimes people really get this mixed up and think that like, oh, I'll hear people say things like, oh, debates don't matter because nobody changes their mind, right? Where what they mean is nobody changes their mind like right there in the room. And of course, that's true, right? Yeah, that would be extremely rare that anybody does that. And well, it'd be even more rare if it was the person you were actually arguing with. But even bystanders, right, aren't usually going to change their mind immediately that day. But I also, but it does plant seeds, right? Like usually, I mean, certainly when I look back at all the times that I've changed my mind in the past, I didn't, I wasn't born thinking everything that I think now, right? So if I look back at all the times I changed my mind in the past, usually when I first encounter arguments for a position that I didn't like, right? My first reaction was like irritation, but then the way it works is usually that you find yourself thinking back to the subject much later, right? And you kind of realize that the very considerations you just dismissed or were irritated before, that like you realize that you feel differently about it than you did before, and that some of the considerations that you dismissed before now seem really relevant to you. And I think that happens all the time. In fact, I often find it kind of ironic, because some of the people who will tell me, oh, nobody ever changes their mind, I always think, okay, come on, I know you, dude. They have like you grew up in like a conservative evangelical Christian household, and then you became an atheist when you were a teenager because you were watching Richard Dawkins videos, and then you were just a regular MSNBC liberal until the 2016 election, and then you supported Bernie Sanders, and then you joined the DSA, and now you're like halfway to Maoism or something. You're going to tell me that nobody ever changes your mind, right? Clearly people change their minds all the time, but it's a process. And I think that we need to be realistic about that, especially because most people aren't like us, right? It makes us slightly strange that we think and read and talk about politics all the time. Most people don't do that, right? So most people will maybe they'll have political reactions to things. They'll have political instincts, but they don't think about it enough for those instincts to really gel together into a completely coherent, internally consistent worldview. So I think that realistically, most people are going to change their minds about most subjects relatively slowly, and it's going to be very uneven, and that's just kind of the deal. And so I think this brings us back to kind of where we started, as far as how to relate to people who might have lots of opinions or might have lots of attitudes, that we have very good reasons for not liking, right? Then what do we do with that? And again, I think that I'm not going to claim to have all the answers, but I do think that part of the answer has to be that that we can work together with people on the things that they can most immediate, that like are most immediate, right? Like I like that you brought up Bernie Sanders, and one of the best things about him is also the thing that like sometimes makes it a little tedious to watch him speak for a long time, because it's almost like watching some rock, it's like going to a Rolling Stones concert, right? They've been playing the same songs for 50 years. That he's gonna say the things about the big banks, he's gonna say the things about the 1%, right? He just sort of constantly recycles the greatest hits, which is actually a really good political instinct, because he's relentlessly refocusing the conversation, or at his best he is, right? I think actually in this election, I think sometimes he slipped because he wasn't doing it as much as he usually does, right? But like, I think that he relentlessly refocuses the conversation on the issues that it plays best to him to have people focus on, right? Which are these kind of bread and butter economic issues. And I think that doing that has to be part of it, right? That we can, okay, maybe I'm going to be arguing with you about abortion for the next 5 years, but while we work on that, right, let's talk about the minimum wage.
Yes, definitely. But unfortunately, you see, I listened to one of the key figures in queer feminism. It is about Judith Butler, and she specifically discussed Bernie Sanders and his campaign. And she said that he is, and I know you know that because you had a whole podcast on the concept, he is a class reductionist.
Mm.
That is the idea that you are going to solve everything by solving the economic inequality and by somehow reducing the cultural problems to the economic ones. And
Yeah.
she was somehow saying that, look, we have the good people, the intersectionalists, and we have the class reductionists. So she had a very black and white perspective. I discussed in length her interview. And of course, there is this accusation that, and it has some meaning, because here in Romania, for instance, let me give you an example. Of course, we had a lot of rights offered to the women after the communists came, because they were allowed to work, they were allowed to divorce, they were allowed to own property, they were allowed to do all sorts of things that they weren't allowed in. And what's interesting is that, for instance, we were more progressive than Great Britain because we had equal pay. There was no problem with that. But in 1966, Ceausescu voted or issued a decree saying that all abortions are banned. And that invaded the privacy of women and just diminished so much of what was gained. So they had this idea that if you offer women daycare, and if you offer them maternity leave and a job and the right to vote, and you give them economic rights, then you solve the problem of domestic violence or of misogyny or of patriarchy. And of course, that's not the case. But anyway, I think it is the starting point. Maybe I am a class reductionist.
No,
I think it's the starting point.
No, I think that's right. I think it is the starting point, and it's also worth mentioning. Like, one of the things that you just said it wouldn't solve is domestic violence, which, don't get me wrong, it certainly wouldn't, right? But it wouldn't solve it in the sense of making it go away, right? But it does make it significantly better, because because one reason that lots of people stay in bad or even abusive relationships is that they can't afford to live on their own. And like certainly in the US, right? People, there's a very powerful incentive that lots of women have to stay in bad marriages because they're worried about losing their spouse's health insurance, and so there are ways in which that economic starting point, it wouldn't make the issue disappear, right? You also need very aggressive laws against it. You also need there is also long-term shifts in cultural attitudes that you need, right? But it would be a very good start even on that issue.
Yes, I completely agree. So if you have anything to add on this topic, maybe a question that I haven't thought about and you would like our viewers and to share it with our viewers.
No, I guess no, I mean, like, I guess that would really be it. I mean, I think you raised the issue of class reductionism, and I guess like one like last thought about that is just that I always think, when I hear people say this, right, like I really want to know exactly what they mean, right? Like a 2 or 3 sentence long definition to like really tell me like what they're talking about, because what it sounds like it means is saying that nothing except for directly economic issues are important, right? And if that's it, then yeah, maybe you do have to go back to Ceausescu to find a real class reductionist. And although I have to, yeah, not that like forcing people to bring pregnancies to term doesn't have all sorts of economic consequences, uh, but it's very, very hard to find anybody on the contemporary left who really fits that definition of class
Mhm.
reductionism. Um, and sometimes people mean like being like analytically reductionist about it. In other words, thinking that there are other kinds of social forces that we can ultimately explain how they work with reference to class. But it's not even obvious that would be how politically relevant that is, right? Whether or not it's true, right? That if I'm a materialist and I think that thoughts and feelings ultimately have to do with processes that are happening in your brain, that doesn't mean that I think that like emotions aren't important, right? And similarly, you could think that all sorts of other social forces have ultimately economic explanations while still thinking those other issues are important. And then sometimes they even mean like that what they mean by class reductionism might even just be some of what we were talking about today, which is just making hard decisions about what your priorities are. And so it seems to me that the effect of throwing around this term class reductionism, which sort of sounds like it means the first thing, but it might mean the second thing or even the third thing, is just really unhelpful, right? I think it adds a lot more confusion than clarity, because I think if you actually had to spell out, here's exactly what it is, the thing I'm objecting to, and here's what's wrong with it, then that would be much more useful than just kind of applying this label to people. Oh, they're class reductionists.
Yes, labeling people is not a good way to solve this type of problems, and I think most of the times it's just a dead end. So, thank you very much for
Yeah,
being here with us today, and I hope our viewers found our discussion interesting. And maybe I'll see you again on different topics in the near future. Thank you very much.
absolutely. Looking forward to it. Thank you.